Segment 2, race and economics. Economic facts and fallacies. Quote, few subjects produce more fallacies than race. Among these fallacies are that, now get ready, I'm going to give you a passage here. Race was the basis of slavery, that racism is the main reason for black-white differences in incomes and in all the other aspects of life that depend on income. Moreover, there is often an implicit assumption that racism and discrimination are so closely linked that they go up or down together. Now, what you have produced is a handful of outrages, and we'll take them one at a time. How's that? Race wasn't the basis of slavery?
Oh, it's a simple historical matter. Slavery existed for thousands of years, as far back as there are any records of human beings. Archaeological finds suggest that slavery existed before human beings could read and write. So, what a racial difference between the slaves and the enslavers, that is a relatively new phenomenon. You didn't have in ancient times the ability to go to another continent and move millions of people of a different race across the ocean. So you enslaved the people who were nearby. The Europeans enslaved Slavs for centuries before they brought the first black African to the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, but so you're not suggesting, you do not wish to say anything other than that slavery as practiced in the United States was, it may have been recent, but you'd be willing to grant that it was particularly perverse and destructive because race got mixed into it at that point, right?
Race got mixed into it in the United States more than anywhere else for a very simple reason. The United States was founded, as the Declaration said, of independence, said all men are created equal.
Right.
If that's true, then the only way you can justify slavery is to say that some men are less than men.
I see. So the racial component.
But in Brazil, where Brazil imported more slaves than the United States, there was no such ideology. Brazil was not a democratic country. The whole issue never arose.
I see. All right. Race doesn't account for differences in black-white income?
No, the differences between income between Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans is greater than the difference between blacks and whites in the United States. Differences in income are the rule, they are not the exception.
So, looking at all these sociological studies that show a persistent gap between African Americans in income and every other form of American in income is what? Useless? It tells us things that we don't need to know? It misleads us? How would you describe that?
Wrong, I think, sums it up. It is not true. Hispanics have a lower per capita income than blacks. Hispanic households and families have a higher income than black households and families, simply because the Hispanic families are larger.
Okay. Now, this last assertion, race and discrimination, you suggest, are not so closely linked that they move up and down together. First of all, distinguish the two, race and discrimination.
Racism is an attitude inside people's heads.
Right.
Discrimination is an overt act taking place outside in the real world.
Okay.
So not only with blacks, but you can find the same thing with Jews in previous centuries, that part of the United States where there was the most racism against blacks, namely the South,
right,
is where black construction workers were much more common than they were in the North, right on into the 20th century. Most people are unaware that in the South, blacks were the construction workers. I remember a professor at Howard University saying that when he was a boy in the South, his father pointed to some man on the street and said, he was the first white construction worker in this town.
And so what was going on there? The racism did not, so whites could think of blacks as somehow or other separate, but they'd still employ them because the market made it profitable to do so.
Yeah, in fact, yes. In fact, a law had to be passed to stop this because in the 20s, and particularly as the Depression got underway, black construction companies in the South using black non-union labor would come up to the North and underbid on government contracts, taking them away. And so this was very common, to the point where they passed the Davis-Bacon Act, which said that on government contracts you must pay the prevailing wage, which translated almost invariably into the union wage.
Right. So your point on the distinction between racism and discrimination is, don't worry about racism. It's inside people's heads. You can't measure it. There's a strongly subjective, just forget about it, concentrate only on discrimination, and the best answer to discrimination is to let markets operate, because then people will discover, it will tend to militate against discrimination.
Oh, yes,
when people have skills to offer, they'll be employed. Whatever this notion of racism in people's heads is, don't worry about that. Is that right?
Yeah, what I'm saying essentially is that racists may prefer one race to another, but they prefer themselves to everybody else.
So they'll do what's profitable.
That's right. That's right.
Got it.
And
Okay.
that was even true in South Africa under apartheid. That there were hundreds of construction companies in South Africa that were fined in a government crackdown because they were hiring more blacks and in higher positions than they were allowed to under the apartheid law, because that was where the money was.
All right.